Hello, very beautiful community. Let's talk a little bit about what happened in Dagestan again, but let's start with the fact that we're about a year out from the Prigozhin mutiny, which nearly created a revolutionary situation in Russia, which even the leading protagonists of the mutiny didn't anticipate. So let's go there first. Now, the Prigozhin mutiny can be conceptualized as Putin's historic practice of outsourcing power to different factions in his court, allowing these factions to conflict, and then coming in and refereeing these conflicts. That's an age-old practice of Putin's, but it weren't suitable to practice it in that way as the regime was reformatting itself. So it's an old practice that he fared well with that suddenly spiraled out of control under very different conditions of war and conditions of a regime that was transforming itself much more than it imagined it would need to, because it ended up with a 7 trillion day rather than a 3-day war. But because that's how I see it, for now, I'm comfortable to say that that political eruption was more a birth pang of a future format of the regime rather than a systemic crack in the regime that's going to rear its head again in the near future. So what happened is highly unlikely to happen in quite the same way, because that whole terrain on which what occurred has now been plastered over. So if anything like that happens again, it would need to be perhaps the Russian army doing it. And if the Russian army did that, then that would be a much more existential and much less survivable event for the regime. But it's still worth just staying with what the Prigozhin mutiny a year on says about the hollowness of Putin's regime, even if it is not a regime that is unstable, perilously unstable. A column was marching on Moscow. People in Moscow were not confident that it would be stopped at all, and that lack of confidence, in my judgment, was justified. National Guard, the police, the FSB seemed to scramble sideways and were waiting to see what happens. The most proactive resistance, apart from a bit of the Russian Air Force, were local government workers digging ditches to stop this. Right, much of the rest of the state, the regime, scrambled sideways and waited to see what happens. And that unbelievable exposure of the hollowness of the regime only occurred 12 months ago. Looking back, there is one thing very distinctive that Prigozhin did, and one thing that's very distinctive that Prigozhin didn't do, and both are important if we talk about the future stability of the regime or the future capacity for internal forces to challenge the regime. The first thing Prigozhin did was, the main thing Prigozhin did was generate a negative discourse about regime incapacity, regime incompetence, that had universal applicability, right? It wasn't just designed for the Z fancying demographic. It wasn't just designed for the security agencies or for the army or for the liberal opposition or for the depoliticized blob in the middle or for other institutions. It was ubiquitous. And the reason it was ubiquitous is because it absolutely centered how the regime was doing whatever it wanted to do, rather than what it is that it should be doing instead of what it's doing. That's to say, the message was, whatever this regime tries to do, they're incompetent. They try to start a war, they're incompetent. I bet if they try to stop the war, they'd be incompetent. Whatever they do, they can't do it. And that, interestingly, for a while, linked the main thrust of Prigozhin's critique of the regime with Navalny's critique of the regime. And of course, they're also now linked by being the two standout political assassinations of the of recent months. So what can be taken away there is that Prigozhin's critique was political. It wasn't moral. It wasn't the moralization of the Russian opposition about joining the civilized world and freedom and democracy. It was a political critique that actually spoke on the doorstep to both different kinds of citizens and different kinds of members of different institutions. My recent visit to Jake Bro's channel with Anna from Ukraine and John from Silicon Curtain, I also tried to make the same point about arguments for support for Ukraine being too moralized. But I enjoyed the whole thing very much, but about 15 minutes in, my health just plummeted a little bit more than I wanted, and I couldn't quite land points that seemed clear in my head, but just didn't come out clear. But one of the points I made was that this excessive moralization is also something that worries me, not just about the discourse of the Russian opposition, how they try to challenge Putin, but in arguments in support of Ukraine, partly because in the West we need to hear more political arguments, and outside of the West, quite frankly, moral arguments just don't have much friction. And we'll talk about why another time. So Prigozhin did this, and that's interesting for future reference. Here is what Prigozhin didn't do, however. He did not offer a positive alternative vision. He did not offer a 3-point political plan for the future of Russia, which had something to say to the interests and concerns of not just different demographics, but different institutions, right? So again, he didn't have a positive proposal that said, hey, Russian army, the world on this space under my proposal would be much better than it is. Hey, FSB, I've got something to tell you. This is how things should look. This is how I'm going to protect your interests, but this is the changes I'm going to make, and this is why it's in your interest to follow me. So there's an absence of that positive proposal. And there are 2.5 things that shift the Russian space politically. Half is economic crisis. You could argue that that could be a major single factor in of itself. I'm going to call it half for today. And then the other 2 are a crack in the regime that is more systemic than the one-off nature that proved to be the truth about the Prigozhin mutiny. And then an idea of an actionable positive proposal, typically generated by one or more political leaders or political agents. So economic crisis, crack in the regime, and an alternative picture that is actionable. Joining the civilized world, overthrowing tyranny, these are not actionable pictures. An actionable picture is telling different citizens in Russia and different institutions, if you do X, Y will follow, and if you do Y, something else will follow, and then this is the outcome you're going to get. So it's worth it. It's worth doing it, right? This is action you can take. That's not just an expression of your political identity. It's actually about actionable transformation toward a clear outcome. only that's going to get a population of that level of depoliticization shifting anywhere, together with a crack in the regime, and then possibly together with economic crisis. Enough on Prigozhin. Dagestan. So we had yesterday attacks on a church, synagogue, and police. These were people, in many cases, from privileged backgrounds, and two were sons of a regional politician. And so that background is perhaps in contrast to folks who seem to be the actors in the Crocus attack. I just want to make three very simple remarks, the most important of which is about the politicization of Russia's counterterrorism work. It's not a joke if whatever goes wrong, you try to blame with ludicrous conspiratorial ineptitude on NATO, Ukraine, and as we were discussing in a recent main channel video on propaganda, on the planet Saturn and its rings. So that dramatically depletes, right, the state agencies' capacities to do their work properly. If the state is set on presenting a picture of events that has very little to do with reality. So it's not just surfaces, it's stuff that's going to obstruct their own preventative and investigative work when they are on the receiving end of certain kind of violence, which may be Islamist fundamentalist violence, and they try to bring in the United States, the rings of Saturn, and Ukraine. And of course, it's going to make international cooperation around these kinds of security concerns even harder for the Russians. So the fact that they have such a deep need to politicize it, it absolutely has an impact on their capacity to deal with this threat seriously. Just a small note worth bearing in mind is that Dagestan is a hotspot of acquisition of people for the front. And it's always worth not overtaxing on, but being open to anti-colonial dimensions of various kinds of violence, even if that violence has no liberatory credentials, even if it's just destruction. Because there's nothing in principle to stop an escalation from a series of one-off events to something that's a few steps toward a civil war dynamic in that region. And the last thing I wanted to mention briefly is the fact that it is risky for Putin, that much of the population, including much of the depoliticized blob, feel that some things have been given up and various kinds of freedoms have been given up for security, so that the country doesn't return to and descend further into the kinds of insecurity vis-a-vis various threats, and in particular fundamentalist violence, that Putin put so centrally at the beginning and said he would deal with. So we sacrificed all of this, and yet the problem seems to be worse than where we started with, potentially. What's the deal here, Mr. Putin? So that is something that absolutely undermines him. And of course, that as this problem escalates for Russia, it will absolutely take chinks out of Putin's legitimacy, because Putin's on record as saying, he's literally verbatim said, Russia cannot be a victim of fundamentalist Islamist violence, because we are a multi-confessional, united rainbow of different ethnic groups, and we're immune from that threat. Well, they're not. And it absolutely takes chinks out of this thing in the Kremlin, Putin, which is the only institution in that country with perceived political legitimacy. Very fleeting, but I hope this helps a little bit. I'm so sorry I was late with this today. Lots of love. Till soon.